book of John. The book of John, and we'll take as long as we need to finish it. It's kind of an interesting book. It's different, though it's included as one of the four Gospels. It's a lot different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. John, the book of John, is believed to have been written by the Apostle John, who was actually, you remember, John was one of the first people that Jesus called after he was. Some of the Gospels have it after he was baptized, some before. But if you go to Matthew chapter 4, verses 18 through 22, we can see that John was one of the first guys. Okay, I'll read it. And Jesus, walking by the Sea of Galilee, saw two brothers, Simon, called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea. So they were the first one, for they were two fishermen. Then he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." They immediately left their nets and followed him. Hi, Emma. We're in John, and we're just doing a kind of introduction. Immediately left their nets and followed him. Going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother. In the boat with Zebedee, their father, mending their nets. He called them, and immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. So according to Matthew, he was like one of the first four. John was one of the first four that was called by Jesus to be an apostle. Now, the book itself doesn't name the writer. You know, he doesn't sign it John. He doesn't say it was written by John. But the references in there, and you'll find it as we go on, is he's referred to as the beloved disciple, and as we'll see, he's a close companion of Peter. If you remember even the Easter program, the two disciples that ran to the tomb after Jesus with Peter and John. Right. So he was a close companion of Peter. And then the people of the early church, people when the church started right after Jesus was ascended, and most of the church was in Jerusalem and in Judea, and then when there was persecution, they spread out. Well, that early church that developed over those first 100 years, let's say, after Jesus was crucified and ascended to heaven, those people believed that the was the Apostle John that wrote the book. So that's how the name got. It was those people in the very early church that were reading this document from John believed that he wrote it. That's why it's named John. And so they believed he wrote this book, and then he wrote 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and the Revelation. Okay. So the early church believed that, so that's why it's named John. Now the three letters, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, there's more reference in the items themselves that indicates John wrote it, and in Revelations. There. So John was actually the last of the apostles to die. And his gospel, that gospel is unique in a lot of ways. It was written long after the others, and perhaps a lot of it is taken from stuff that they wrote. Some people say possibly 40 years after Jesus' life on earth, John wrote it. It may have been that long after Jesus died and went back to heaven that John wrote it. Unlike Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which are written to present Jesus to different cultural groups. John, for example, Matthew's gospel was written to the Jewish people of that day. Okay? And Mark's gospel, remember when we studied that, Mark's gospel was actually written to the Christians in Rome, to the Roman Christians. So Matthew wrote his gospel for the Jews. Mark wrote his gospel for his gospel for the people, the Christians in Rome. And Luke's gospel, if you remember in the very beginning, he's writing to somebody called Theophilus, right? Now, it's either Theophilus is either an actual person or lover of God, which is what Theophilus means. So he either wrote to he wrote to an individual. That's what he's saying. Luke wrote to an individual. John's gospel was written more for universally, more actually for Gentiles. John's gospel is written actually more for Gentiles than the other three. And then the book of John really goes into describing the man Jesus, and John's gospel reveals Jesus as God. His gospel really reveals Jesus as God. As a matter of fact, a lot of churches today, especially evangelical churches today, with somebody who's saved, just brand new, they suggest, after they suggest go, find a Bible-believing church, they suggest that person read the book of John as the first book that they really read and study once they become Christians. And again, the reason is that because John really talks about the man Jesus and the fact that he is God. As a matter of fact, near the end of John, in John chapter 20, verse 31, he actually kind of tells why he wrote the book. John chapter 20, verse 31. You got it? You have it, Houston?
Yes.
Okay.
But these are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life through his name.
Okay, and that's really in summary why he wrote this book to Gentile Christians and new Christians. Now, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called synoptic Gospels. SYNOPTIC. Synoptic Gospels.
Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Matthew, Mark. Now, synoptic means it's a general summary or synopsis, right? Okay, of the life of Jesus, and those three books contain many of the same stuff, and they're similar in sequence, similar in wording. Those three, okay. John, on the other hand, is not a synoptic gospel, and there's some major differences. Let me kind of go over those. You read Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Okay, there's a lot of stuff in them that is not in John, right? So, for example, some of the stuff that's not in John, that's in the other Gospels, is the temptation of Jesus is not in John. You remember after he's baptized and he's taken to the desert and tempted? Okay, it's in Matthew in chapter 4. Okay, in Mark in chapter 1, it talks about, but it's a real short blurb. Mark 1, 12 and 13 says that Jesus was taken to, that one's real short, so read that one. Mark 1, 12 and 13. Okay, got it?
Immediately the Spirit drove him into the wilderness, and he was there in the wilderness 40 days, tempted by Satan, and was with the wild beasts.
Okay.
And the angels ministered unto him.
Okay. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have the occasion of Jesus' temptation. John doesn't. Okay. The transfiguration is not in John. Remember the transfiguration? Remember Peter, John, and who else? James went to the mountain with Jesus, right? And he was transfigured. They saw this blinding light. He was in white, and Moses and Elijah and Peter said, "Hey, let's make some tabernacles for you guys." And Jesus and the voice from God said, "This is my son, in whom I listen, hear him." Okay, that was a big deal, right? That's not in John. Okay, Again, because John's emphasis is on convincing people that Jesus is God, the Son of God, right? And that there's life in him. So the emphasis of these other guys, although they all indicate that Jesus is divine, okay, the emphasis is different. The Lord's Supper, it's surprising to me, I didn't realize it either. The Lord's Supper, the beginning, the initiation of the Lord's Supper is not in John. It's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Okay, it's not mentioned by John. John doesn't mention any examples of Jesus casting out demons. Matthew, Mark, and Luke do, right? The Sermon on the Mount is not in John. And there's no narrative parables in John. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have them, but John doesn't. Again, because he's writing for a different reason and a different purpose. Because John is writing for new Christians, right? That's his main emphasis, is to write, especially Gentile Christians, brand new. And so his emphasis is on Jesus and the fact that it reveals Jesus as God and that there's life through him. But there's information in John that's not in the others. Matter of fact, a lot of stuff. In John chapters 2 through 4 describe a lot about Jesus' early ministry. The thing where he turns water into wine is in John. It's not in the others. Talks a lot about his early ministry in Galilee. The others don't. The other, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, have nothing about Jesus' early ministry in Galilee. The resurrection of Lazarus is not in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. It's in John, but not in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. Remember when Jesus was before the crucifixion, he had this long discussion with the disciples, and that's in John chapters 13 through 17. If you go that quickly, that's not in the other Gospels. That's when John was talking about he's going back to his Father. He's going to send the Holy Spirit. He had a long conversation with his disciples that people call the farewell discourse. This is his, I'm getting ready to go. That's not in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That's also, and this is very interesting, I didn't realize this. According to John, right, and we often hear this, according to John, Jesus' public ministry lasted 3 years, right? Okay? And you can tell it from John's Gospel. If you read the other Gospels, it appears that his ministry was only 1 year, because they're concentrating on the last. Yeah, let me give some examples. In John, as we get through it, it indicates that Jesus goes several times to Jerusalem. Okay? In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it only appears to describe one journey of Jesus into Jerusalem. And that's the final one, the triumphal entry. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke describe that. But in John talks several times about Jesus going to Jerusalem, which may indicate that his public ministry lasted 3 years. If you didn't have John, you might only think that the public ministry only lasted 1 year. In Matthew, in chapter 21, verses 1 through 13, that's a triumphal entry. That's the only mention in Matthew of Jesus going to Jerusalem. In Mark, it's chapter 11, verses 1 through 11. And that's the only time that Mark mentions Jesus going into Jerusalem. Luke now, on the other hand, mentions Jesus in Jerusalem 4 times. However, okay, the first time that he mentions that Jesus was ever in Jerusalem was in chapter 2, verse 22. And so we remember what we were saying, that Jesus' ministry lasted 3 years. Well, Luke mentions Jesus in Jerusalem 4 times, but of those times, only one of them was the ministry. Luke chapter 2, verse 22. That's what?
Now when the days of her purification according to the law of Moses were completed, they brought him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord.
Okay.
That was the circumcision.
Well, actually, no, he was circumcised before, but it was required that all the male child be presented to the Lord. They had to go to the temple. So that's one. So that's not his ministry, right? He's not involved in his ministry. Okay. The second time is when he went to when he was 12. When he went. Remember when he went to Jerusalem with his parents, and they for whatever that festival was, and they left. And I've often thought about this. How could you take a kid from 12 and you go, and then you leave, and you're gone a couple of days before you realize that he's not with you? But that's the second time he's mentioned. He's in Jerusalem. You remember that story, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's the second time. Again, that's before his ministry, right? Okay. The third time that Luke mentions that Jesus in Jerusalem was when Satan took him up on the temple during the temptation. Go to Luke 4, verse 9. So in that time, he may have been in the spirit, not physically. Again, that's before his public ministry started. Luke chapter 4, verse 9.
And he brought him to Jerusalem and set him on the principal, on what's that,
Pinnacle, I guess.
pinnacle of the temple, and said unto him, If thou be the Son of God, cast thyself down from hence.
Okay, so that's the third time Luke mentions Jesus going to Jerusalem. But again, that's not his ministry has public ministry hasn't started. So if you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you would only think Jesus went to Jerusalem one time, and the time he went was the time before his crucifixion, right? John mentions him in Jerusalem several times, and he mentions it at him going at the time of festivals, which would mean, so it'd be different years. The first time is in chapter 2, verse 13.
Chapter 2,
Luke, John. I'm
John
sorry,
chapter
John.
2,
Yeah,
verse
John.
13?
Yeah, John chapter 2, verse 13.
Okay.
Again,
First John?
no, John, the book of John, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, book of John.
Yeah, this, and remember what we're doing. All we're doing now is just a little introduction on the book, and then we'll get into the details of the book next week. John 2:13.
And the Jews' Passover was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem.
Okay, all right. So he mentions Jesus going into Jerusalem. Then, and it was at that time he cleared the temple. Remember, what verse 13 says? It says, "Passover time." If you keep reading, he cleared the temple. So read 14. So read.
And found in the temple those that sold oxen and sheep and doves, and the changers of money sitting. 15:2.
No. Well, yeah. Go on. Yeah, keep reading.
And when he had made, what's that? What's that word? Scourge
Okay.
Yeah.
of small cords. He dove them all over of the temple and the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the changers money and overthrew the tables.
Yeah. So what he did, he made a whip out of cords. Yeah, cords. He made a whip and
What do you made a whip for?
to get them, clear them out of there.
Wow.
You do it, pew, you know, that kind of whip to clear the temple. All right. So John mentions him going there. And that's it. That's his Passover time, right? Okay. Then John chapter 5, verse 1. Okay.
After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem.
Okay. All right. So that's 2 times, right? Chapter 12, verse 12.
On the next day, much people that were come to the feast, when they heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem.
Okay, and that might have been the time that Matthew, Mark, and Luke were writing, the triumphal entry. All right, so there was a crowd. So by John's account, Jesus' ministry lasted for at least 3 years. So that's where we get that. That's where we get the thing. A lot of people talk about Jesus' ministry lasted 3 years. He was 30 and he at 33 he died. That's where that's how that.
His ministry lasted 3 years.
Yeah, right. So Jesus' public ministry lasted 3 years. Remember, Jesus. There's very little known about Jesus as a child. His birth is mentioned, right? Luke talks about him going to Jerusalem with his parents when he's 12. But beyond that, there's nothing known about Jesus' early years until his public ministry is started. When the first mention of his ministry started is when it talks about him going, John baptizing him, and then his public ministry starts. That's when he starts. That's when he goes and calls his disciples, and that's when he starts. The miracles start, and that's when he starts talking to people about the kingdom of God. So there's really nothing known about Jesus before his public ministry starts. So John emphasizes the person, the nature, and the role of Christ. The synoptics kind of describe it's a summary of Jesus' activities, right? But John really emphasizes the person himself, as his nature, and the role of Jesus. And then we can kind of get a sense of it with the very first verse of John. What's John chapter 1, verse 1? Read that.
Verse, what was that again?
John chapter 1, verse 1.
Give somebody else a chance. Give somebody else a chance.
Emma, you got it? John 1:1?
It's in the beginning.
Uh-huh.
In the beginning was the Word,
Mhm.
and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That actually sounds a lot like the very first of the Bible, doesn't it? Doesn't it? So John, the word that John uses for word, okay, the Greek word that John uses that's translated word is logos. That's spelled Logos. Logos. Okay, and logos is a Greek term that's translated word. It's translated speech. It's translated principle or thought. And in Greek philosophy, it's referred to a universal divine reason or the mind of God. That's what. So if he's writing to Gentile Christians, they understand what he's saying when he uses logos, right? So John is arguing that the word, or logos, okay, is eternal, because he talks about, it says that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. So he says that the Logos, or the Word, is eternal and is God. And that all creation came about through Jesus, who's also presented as a source of life. So that's what John writes. These are the Synoptic Gospels start with. Mark starts with the John the Baptist's baptism, right? Matthew and Luke begin with the birth of Christ. John begins by saying that Jesus essentially is God. That's really kind of what he's saying. Jesus is eternal. Jesus was with God before he came to earth. It says, in the beginning was the Word. Okay, the Word was with God, and it says that the Word was God. So he's saying Jesus is God. That all things were made through him. He's a giver of life, and then he came to dwell among us. So what John is saying from the very beginning is this man he's writing about is God, and he came now to live with us. And like I said, that John 1:1 sounds a lot like Genesis 1:1, doesn't it? Again, we're looking at the differences between John and the synoptic gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. One, there's a lot of stuff in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And they're real similar. All of them are very similar. They have most of the same events, same stuff. John doesn't have the temptation of Jesus in there. He doesn't have the transfiguration. He doesn't even have the beginning of the Lord's Supper in there. Where these others don't. Again, because John's purpose is to really talk about the nature of who God is, and it's written to early Christians so that they can understand who this person is, and John says he is God, so there's life through him. So that's why certain details that are in Matthew, Mark, and Luke are not in John. Another difference between the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, is kind of the way that it's written. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are written in third person. You know, that's describing events as if they had observed, like a reporter, right? They are written as if they were reporting events, so they're descriptive. They're describing certain stuff that happens, right? Okay. John's gospel, though, is also written from a third person point of view, but his is more reflective. Okay? His is more like, if you think about a news reporter. Matthew, Mark, and Luke reporting as if a reporter out on the street with his mic, which is reporting what he saw. All right. John's gospel is more like an editorial. Okay? An editor sees something that happened, and then he reflects on what has happened. An example. John sees things, reports that it's happened as an eyewitness. But as you read it, he'll say a lot of times that you'll see that it says, and they, good example. When, if you can, I remember the story. If you remember when Mary and Joseph took Jesus in to be dedicated, right? And there was this guy named Simeon, and he prophesied, right? And what it says is that Mary started saying Mary, and it says that Mary kept all of these things in her heart, reflected on them later. That's the way John writes. Though he saw them, it's more they'll reflect. As an editor would write. The president makes an executive decision, executive order, right? A reporter reports the executive order is blah, 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 right? An editor would then write, okay, the president did blah, 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 and here is what will happen because he did this. That's what, and an editor gives his opinion, right? Reporters don't. That's the difference between those gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke were reporters. John was an editor. We're writing an editorial. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Makes sense? So that's why you'll see some differences in the Gospels, and you can wonder. That's why a lot of times people say that there's conflict in the Gospel. Matthew, Mark, and Luke report almost the same thing. John reports very little of what they reported, but talks about some other things.
What stood out about John, or what are we supposed to absorb
From
from
John?
the separation?
Yeah. From John?
From the separation of him from the other.
Okay, the thing. Remember the thing that John. The reason for John's writing is so that these Gentile Christians who don't know anything, who don't know much about the Jews and their belief for the Messiah, none of that stuff, why they now should believe that Jesus is the Messiah that came for the Jews, and that he is in fact God, that you're believing in him, and that there is life in him, life because of him. Again, that's why a lot of churches, when somebody comes to salvation, is saved, right? What they'll suggest is that person read, the first book they should read is the book of John. Because when you're saved, the people come in and say you're saved through Christ, and then you do this with prayer, and you're saved. All right. So now what they suggest is, okay, you read the book of John, because that's going to tell you about this person through whom you receive salvation. This person is really God, and this is why we can say that you are saved through him. That's why the difference. That's the major difference.
Was there any reason why he was picked? I mean, like Paul, on Damascus, there was there something that happened to John?
John was an eyewitness. John was with him. Remember,
okay.
right. Remember, John was with him, and so John was with him. So he had first-hand knowledge. Okay, and he was with him. So and these other guys had already written. Like I said, John's gospel was written long after the others. These other guys had written their stuff, and so now John is writing to these brand new Christians as to what the importance of this person in whom you believe. That's the difference. There's no parables in his book. There's no casting out demons in John. His emphasis is on Jesus and his nature, not what he did necessarily, but on who Jesus really is. That's his emphasis, on who Jesus really is, and Jesus is God, because that's what he says in the very beginning. That's what John says in the very beginning. So that's the emphasis. Emphasis. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have parables that are kind of short. John's dialogues, if you look for red, if you got a Bible that's red, the red stuff that's long discourse of Jesus, of saying what Jesus said and did. For example, the conversation between Nicodemus and Jesus, okay, is not in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. Right? The conversation, and that's important because it's from when Nicodemus, he said, you have to be born again. Right? That's okay. None of that's in the synopsis. The conversation with the lady at the well, okay, is not in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. It's in John. But what's significant about that is that he tells the Samaritan woman, first of all, Samaritan women they're not Jewish, right? Okay, and so the Jews believe that the Messiah was coming to them only. He's spending time with a person who's not Jewish, right? And she's telling him, our ancestors say we worship here. You Jews say you worship in Jerusalem. What's right? And Jesus says, time will come when you have to worship God in spirit and in truth. Those are So again, he's talking about Jesus and the nature of Jesus and who he is. And that's not in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There's a lot of other stuff that's in that are differences between Matthew, Mark, and Luke and John. But the bottom line is the purpose of the book with John, remember, is in chapter 20, verse 30 and 31. Go to John 20, 30 and 31. That's the real reason that John wrote this book and why it's different. Okay, what does it say? John 20, 30 and 31. 30 and 31, yeah. I'll read it. And truly Jesus did many signs in the presence of disciples which are not written in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. That's why John wrote the book. Another thing that kind of summarizes John and the theme of the gospel is John 3:16. We all know that, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Gospel of the Word gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. That's important. The date of John, they think it was written somewhere between 80 and 90 A.D. Pretty late, right? After, because the other apostles, the others had been written, right? Matthew, Mark, and Luke. As a matter of fact, they think that Mark is the very first one, and then Matthew and Luke wrote later. And according to tradition, John spent the latter years of his life in Ephesus, which is interesting, which is where Paul established the church, right, in Ephesus. And that he carried on a ministry of preaching and teaching and writing. So maybe he wrote it there. And then from Ephesus, he got exiled to the Isle of Patmos, which is where he wrote Revelation. Yeah. John is the only one interesting. John is the only one of the disciples that was not executed. Okay, he died of natural death. All the rest of them were martyred. You know, Peter was crucified upside down at his choice. He wanted to be crucified upside down because he did not want to be, he did not want to be done the same way Jesus is, because he would have felt it would have been an affront to Jesus for him to be crucified in the manner that he was crucified. So do me upside down. So
can you give us a few words on how he died?
Who?
John.
Yeah, he just died, natural death.
How old was he?
He was pretty old. He died pretty old. Now, but I don't know the age. But he died. If he died, if they think, if they're right, when people believe that he died, that he wrote John 40 years after Jesus' crucifixion, he would have been in his 60s or 70s, maybe. But who knows? But it was long after the other guys had died. So that's kind of background as to John. Why it's different. John's an interesting book, and it's written. And what we'll find as we go through it, that John's emphasis is on revealing who Jesus really is. And John says, if you read it, John says Jesus is God. He says at the very beginning. And then so he writes the rest of the book to reveal that in fact that's the case. And if Jesus is God, okay, and he says that God gave his only begotten Son, you might have whoever believes in him should have life and should have eternal life, then if you believe in him, then you have life. So John is saying he wants to reveal this guy, and so that you know that through him you have life. That's really the reason that he wrote the book. And we'll find it's going to be interesting as we go through it. and really delve into it. Especially for and this will help us in our witness to new Christians. It'll help us to explain some things to again so that they can understand that there's life in through Christ. Okay, let's see. Heavenly Father, thank you for this time together. Thank you, Lord God, for this beginning of the study of John. Next week, Heavenly Father, as we begin to get in the book, I pray that you will bless us and guide us.